This is the first lecture in the evolution and natural selection topic, and this first part of the lecture is going to be on Darwin and the history of evolutionary thought. So before we talk about Darwin and his description of how change occurs among organisms over time periods, I have to first kind of back up and give you a little bit of history about what people thought about organisms and the relationships between each other before Darwin's theory was proposed. First of all, people thought at that time that the Earth was very young, just a few thousand years old. We now know it's greater than 4.2 billion years old. They also thought that once a species was around, that it didn't change ever. Of course, all you have to do is look at the rise of antibiotic resistance among bacteria, or the fact that we have to get a flu shot every year because the flu shot evolves, to know that in fact species do change, and some change extremely rapidly within a matter of months in some cases, such as with the flu virus and with some types of bacteria. The belief was that a creator dictated adaptations to the environment. In other words, some higher power was controlling what kind of change an organism made in order to better survive in its environment. And they also, for many years, had believed in something called spontaneous generation. And spontaneous generation is basically the idea that living organisms can sprout from an inanimate object. For example, a farmer might leave a bag of grain in his barn and come back a week later and see a whole bunch of mice in the bag of grain. They would have thought that the mice sprouted spontaneously from the grain seed. Of course, we know that's not true now, but these were some of the ideas that were believed at the time. And then in the early 1700s to mid-1700s, Carolus Linnaeus, whom we've talked about already, came up with this idea of binomial nomenclature for the naming of species. And he purported that there was a natural ladder, or what's called the scala naturae, which describes the relationships and hierarchy among organisms. And if you look over here in this picture, it basically said that that there was sort of a hierarchy of value and complexity among organisms, and that plants were more complex than minerals, animals were more complex than plants, then men were more complex than women's, then there were demons, angels, and the most complex, the most evolved being was God. And now, so this is just kind of giving you a context of where people were at prior to the mid-1800s, when Darwin proposed his theory of evolution and the idea of natural selection. And when he and other scientists began noticing how well adapted organisms were to their individual environments, it really began a sort of shift in scientific thought, and a shift in the kinds of ways and the approaches we use to describe how organisms change in relationship to their environment. Now, there were a couple of predecessors to Darwin who helped him develop his ideas, and I'm going to only discuss two of them. There were a number of them, but the two I'm going to focus on were Georges Cuvier. He was a geologist from 1769 to the early 1830s, and he's considered the father of paleontology. And he really did a lot to really bring forth this idea that the Earth is old rather than young. And that was a really critical point for Darwin, because in order for Darwin to suggest that adaptations accumulate gradually over generations and over thousands of years and millions of years, we had to first accept the idea that the Earth was old enough for this to have occurred on its own. And so, this idea of having fossils, which, by the way, paleontology is the study of fossils such as dinosaurs. When Georges Cuvier kind of brought forth this idea that, look, we have these fossil organisms and they are indicative of a Earth that is far older than we thought, that was a critical piece of information for Darwin's theory. Georges Cuvier also came up with the idea of catastrophism, which is that there are these Uh, there are certain points in the geologic record that show there were catastrophic events that may have been sort of the tipping point for organisms to undergo rapid adaptations in order to better fit a newly changed environment. Now, the second individual who were very pinnacle, I guess, to sort of the build up to Darwin and his ideas on natural selection and evolution was Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Lamarck was a French scientist. He was around in the mid 1700s to the early 1800s, about the same time as Georges Cuvier, and he purported that we have this inheritance of acquired characteristics, that we inherit certain acquired characteristics from our parents and we pass them on to our children. He was erroneously associated with this idea that how giraffe got longer necks is they were stretching their necks to try to reach food, and their stretched neck was passed on to their offspring. We now know that's not true, and in fact giraffes have a long neck as a part of a sexual selection characteristic in which males battle one another through some complex engagements that involve winding their necks around each other. But the purpose of the long necks is less about food acquisition and more about mate acquisition, getting females. Anyway, these ideas were all coming into play in the time that Darwin was a young man, and where Darwin really got the opportunity to begin to develop his ideas on species and their adaptation and changes to the environment began when he was taken aboard the HMS Beagle, which was a British Navy ship that set out in 1831 to circumnavigate the planet, and in doing so to do some cartography, so drawing of maps, and also the gathering of different animal and plant specimens. It was basically a voyage of discovery, and Darwin, who had been studying at university, his father had hoped that he would become a clergyman, ended up convincing his father that he really wanted to go on this around the world tour, and his father finally acquiesced and said he could go. So you can see on this map here how they left Great Britain. They went around the southern tip of South America, across the Pacific Ocean, over by Australia, up into the Indian Ocean, around the south point of Africa, back again over to South America, and then finally returned to Great Britain. And it took several years. And along the way, as the naturalist on board of the ship, Darwin was given the opportunity to do a lot of study of biogeography, to really see how Cuvier's comments about the fossil record and catastrophism played out on other continents. So he was studying geology. He studied biogeography, which is basically the distribution of living organisms across different areas. And he began to notice things, for example, like, well, in South America, they didn't really have rabbits, but they had another organism that looked very similar to a rabbit that you see a picture of here. He began to notice similarities, that even if you didn't have the same exact organism as they had in England, they'd have a very similar organism that was similarly adapted to the same types of environmental pressures as what you would see in Great Britain. He also studied the fossils and began to see relationships among the extinct organisms in the fossil records and their current descendants today. And all of these ideas that he had culminating as he made his trip around the world on the HMS Beagle led him to propose in the 1850s an idea which said that organisms are related to one another via descent, and that species can change and become a new species when, over generations and generations and generations, adaptations are selected for that help the organism survive better in the environment. And the key here is there's got to be a lot of time for this to happen, and that's where Georges Cuvier's idea that, you know, we have this long record on planet Earth, long geologic record, helps support Darwin's idea that through multiple generations and hundreds of thousands and in many cases millions of years are required for the slow accumulation of adaptations that lead to the divergence of two species. So I'll give you a couple of sample organisms he studied out on the Galapagos Islands, which, let me go back here for a second. The Galapagos Islands are over here off the west coast of South America. And he studied finches there. And what we know about the Galapagos Islands is they are so far remote from any large continental land mass that it's very difficult for any living organisms to get to that island. And Darwin postulated that a finch or a handful of finches were blown off a migratory route during a storm or something similar to that, got to the Galapagos Islands, so we're more or less stuck there, and over multiple generations radiated into a whole bunch of different species. So we started with one ancestor species that gave rise to lots of different species, all of whom were finch, but that had each type of species of finch has adapted very specifically to a certain niche in their environment. So you can see in this picture here are three different of Darwin's finches. This one over here looks more like a raven or a crow. The one in the center looks very much like an insectivore, some sort of a bird that eats lots of insects. And this one over here on the left has a beak like a grosbeak and much more likely to eat large seeds. That process of a small number of individuals again eventually giving rise over generations to a large number of different species is called adaptive radiation. He also found a similar sort of event which occurred with tortoises that appeared in the Galapagos Islands. Now that's the end of our first lecture on evolution and natural selection. In the next one we'll be talking about the mechanisms by which this evolution occurs.